Morning everybody and welcome to NECN's YouTube channel. Morning everybody and welcome to NECN's YouTube channel. We've got some fantastic content for you today about youth work, but more of that in a minute. First of all, I want to tell you about EETG, the Estates Evangelism Task Group, which next Monday is having a conference. And they're gathering a lot of people together who work in estates around the country. So there's big organisations who are going to be there, you know, people like Church Army and stuff like that. But there are three keynote speeches which are going to be happening at it. And we would like to invite you to come along and share with that and join in online. There's going to be Rosie Hopley talking about working on the margins, which is going to be Monday at 2:30. We've got the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, who is going to be doing the evening session at 7:15. And then on Tuesday morning, early on, if you can get yourself out of bed for 9 a.m, Chris Lane and Hannah Amner are going to be talking about church planting on estates. Now they're all going to be live, they're all going to be streamed from the conference facility, but you can join in online by getting involved with the hashtag, which is EETG 2021. Come along, be involved in the conversation. I know that the Archbishop is going to be taking questions, so hopefully we'll be able to get some of the questions that come from you guys on the internet as well. It's all on our YouTube channel, which if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, subscribe to it now, click the bell, because then it'll give you a notification when we go online. Other than that, I will hand over to Amy Bland, who is doing today's content. She came along to the Estates Evangelism Task Group and she presented about research she'd done into working with young people on estates. It's part of an MA that she did. And as she was doing it, I said, that would be absolutely amazing if we'd had a camera pointing at you and we'd live streamed it to the internet. Well, she said that what she would do is she would record it for us and she sent it to me. So here it is. I'll hand over to Amy Bland now.
Hi, my name's Amy. I'm a curate in Lancashire. And I'm going to talk today about some of my master's dissertation research looking at youth ministry in estate churches. So just as a start, let me give you some definitions to help you know what I'm talking about. So first of all, youth, I'm talking about children who are aged 0 to 16. There are lots of different ways to define youth. It could be teenage years, all kinds of different things. But I'm looking at 0 to 16-year-olds, partly because that's one of the data sets that the Church of England collects, but also it's a good category for us to see what's going on in churches. In terms of large, I am referring to churches with 25 or more under 16s, as recorded in the average Sunday attendance, the October count. My work is looking at data from 2018, so it's churches who had 25 or more under 16s on a Sunday in 2018. In terms of ministry, I'm thinking about things with a Christian ethos. So parts of the work we're looking at Sunday attendance, but I also looked at other things churches do to engage with young people and to proclaim the good news. And what is an estate church? Well, I'm looking at churches where there are 500 or more social homes in a parish. They could be anywhere in the country, but it's places with 500 or more social homes. So, as we start, some decline statistics just to set the picture of what we're looking at. In 2018, there were fewer than 100,000 children in Church of England churches on Sundays. This is the first time that that number has dropped below 100,000. Now, child decline is faster than adult decline. Child attendance is declining at about 20% over the last 5 years, compared to 12% decline in adult attendance. So it reminds us the importance of looking at child attendance and why children do or don't come to church. And there are approximately 20% of Church of England parishes that are estate parishes. However, only 14% of parishes have 25 or more under 16s are estate parishes. So there is some discord between the national picture on estate parishes and those with large youth ministries, and so some work needs to be done there. But this is a good news report. This is not about decline. It's looking at churches where things are going well and seeing what can we learn, what can we share, with other churches, with other estate churches. So for my research, what did I do? My research is based off the work Jimmy Dale did as part of the General Synod Report 2161. It looked at all the churches across England with 25 or more under 16s. And so I looked at that data and his methodology and did the same, but just for estate parishes. So I looked at those churches with 25 or more under 16s, which also have 500 or more social homes in their parish. And I did a mixture of quantitative research looking at the data that he collected and collecting my own through websites, finding out if churches employ youth workers, if they have strong links with a school, what tradition they could be defined as well as other data like parish share, how much they're paying, their IMD data, and combined with their average Sunday attendance, the October count number. I unfortunately didn't find much looking at these patterns, looking at churches and these patterns and what seems to be linked to larger churches. Now, although that was disappointing, it is interesting that Jimmy Dale found 6 key factors that influenced and that seemed to be associated with the larger churches. But when looking at estate parishes, those factors didn't seem to come through. And so it suggests possibly that the national picture is different to the estate church's picture. And so when we employ strategy nationally, we need to remember that that might not be the same. That might not work as well in estates. So I did some quantitative research, and then I also interviewed 5 different churches from that selection to find out more about what they did, why it worked and how it worked. I tried to pick churches that were a mixture of different things that I'd collected data on, so a mixture of traditions. I talked to a mixture of people, some churches that did employ youth workers, some that didn't. And so the findings I'm going to share with you are the key themes that came through those interviews, the findings that came through that qualitative research, those interviews. So there were 3 things that seemed to come through the interviews. They were sharing spaces, a church for all, and resourcing leaders. So let me expand on them. By sharing spaces, I mean that the community is in the church and the church is in the community. So something about physical space, about sharing physical spaces in a parish. There were schools that had churches that had good links with schools. They had community spaces where church and members of the community who weren't involved in church could meet each other. And they also talked something about the importance of a church building, that it was in a good location or that it was well used or well utilizable. So these are some things that some of the people I interviewed said that show what sharing spaces is about. So Alexander says, "We support the schools and they seem to be at the heart of the communities." Schools came through again and again. I think in all of the churches that I talked to, they saw that they either wanted to invest more in schools or that they had a good relationship with their school. And that was key to their relationship with young people. An obvious fact, but nearly all children go to school. And so being involved in schools is a way to meet many, many young people. Daniel says, all of those relationships were cross-fertilising, and it meant a whole load of people who were accessing Tulip Road Family Centre, that who would never have accessed something in church, started building relationships. So he talked of a link with a local family centre, where members of church would be involved there and would get to know families with their own families, and those relationships would start building. Sharing a physical space, being in spaces where other members of the community are, was really important to Daniel. And something else Alexander says, there's something safe about the building as well, we found. In an estate where there can be difficulties and challenges, it's quite nice to have a peaceful place to go. That's one of the things we can offer. Having a good building was important to a number of people. A space that was flexible or could be used well, and that was in the right location, maybe opposite the school or in the centre of the estate. Having a physical space where people could come and other spaces where church members could go to meant that people were sharing spaces, they were bumping into each other, and those relationships were forming and cross-pollinating because people met each other in multiple different spaces. So, a church for all, what does this theme mean? It was all about all-age congregations and relationships. It was important that youth weren't isolated or excluded, the people I interviewed. They thought that church needs to be a place where all ages are welcome together. And so there were 3 themes that came out of that: welcoming disruption, family evangelism, and mentoring. So Daniel says, "It was awful and wonderful at the same time." This was him recounting when they had about half children and half adults at their services, and the craziness that went on. When there are lots of children, it is sometimes awful and wonderful at the same time. There is disruption. Things don't go the way an all-adult service would go. But it is wonderful, Daniel says. We need to be prepared to welcome that disruption, whatever's going on. And Bert talks about a mum's pamper night, where children from their Friday night kids group invited their mums to come to a pamper night. They were keen to have evangelism for the whole family. It was not just a thing for children, but parents and other relatives were invited to come and hear about what the children have been learning about, to come and hear about Jesus. Coming to church is hard if you're a kid on your own, and so that church particularly wanted to invite parents and others to come and be part of the church. And Daniel says he's a 17-year-old black British Nigerian kid who's in a mentoring relationship with a 33-year-old Irish structural engineer woman. And so that's church at its best. One way that a number of different interviewees talked about the importance of young people and engaging them with others in church was through mentoring, through linking young people up with adults who are different to them, but who can share all kinds of life experiences. And here Daniel was telling a story of a 17-year-old who wanted to be a structural engineer, and so the church found someone who was from the church congregation, and they met up, and this boy could be encouraged, he could be shown how to do it better, how to get into university, all those kind of things. These kind of intergenerational relationships don't happen in many areas of society, and so church is one of those places where that can be. It's a gift to young people to have adults of all age interested in them, interested and caring for them. So that was a church for all. And my third theme was resourcing leaders. And there were 4 parts of resourcing leaders that I kind of came across. So that was someone with oversight, having leaders with experience who are there for the long haul, having peer leaders, and having a diverse team. Resourcing leaders was all about what is a well-supported team like. So a key question that I came into this research with, and I read other literature about, was whether to employ a youth worker or not. Is that the golden bullet? Is that the way to really help young people flourish and come to Christ and be involved in church? Well, I found that it wasn't necessarily employing a youth worker that was the important thing. It was having someone who had oversight of the youth work. All the churches I talked to had something in common, which was someone was overseeing the youth ministry. It was their key focus. Now, not all churches have someone who could do that, who could be responsible for what was going on, who could organise it, keep it going for the long run. And so that might be where you need to pay someone, where paying a youth worker would be a good thing if that person can't be found in the congregation. But I spoke to a lovely man who had been running children and youth work in his parish for 40 years. That was his focus. He worked full-time somewhere else, but he was fully invested and dedicated to the work with children and young people in his church. Now, experience was another key thing that came through, and Daniel said, "I massively bemoan the lack of mature, professional Christian youth ministers in this country. I think the Church of England has not resourced youth ministry properly. Keeping youth workers around for a long time, keeping that experience that they've grown, is really important if you want to develop, if you want to have good youth work that stands the test of time." And Daniel noted that actually some youth workers are in charge or responsible for as many as some clergy are, and as many young people as some clergy are responsible for adults. And so he says, if we are going to invest in youth work, then we need to invest in youth workers so that this is a job that they can stick around for the long term, that they can be involved in, that they're not forced to change what they're doing because they aren't paid enough or don't get enough hours, but that they should be properly invested in. Now, Bert says, "I think that consistency and building relationships is fundamental to the success of children's work. It's building relationship for the long term." A number of different interviewees talked about long-term commitment to youth work, not just coming in and going, but long-term. And his church, in fact, wondered if they could employ a youth worker and thought, well, we've only got a few years of funding, and so perhaps someone would come, start something, and then leave, and then nothing, and then it would stop again. And so they decided not to, but rather to invest in their volunteers to be able to keep these relationships going for a long time. Committing to long-term financial investment is difficult for many churches, especially estate parishes if they are receiving money from a charity or from other grant bodies. And so there needs to be some consideration of what is going to happen when this money ends or when this youth worker ends. What is the long-term strategy for this? There needs to be some kind of plan that's not just, 3 years is up. What is going to happen next? Now, another important part of leadership, which was mentioned, was peer leadership, and Daniel was running a 12-week paid work experience scheme for 16 and 17-year-olds to be involved in youth work. His church had this scheme where they were paying the living wage to 16 and 17-year-olds to run youth group for a few hours a week and to prepare it. And this was a way that both those young people could be invested in. They could have something to put on their CV, they could develop in faith and leadership, but also the young people that they were teaching, that they were working with. Those young people saw people just a bit older than them who were living life for Jesus, who were following him, and they could see what that was like. Peer leaders seem to be a really important way both to retain older teenagers but also to engage younger people. But that needs an experienced person to be in charge of. And again, that comes to having mature, experienced youth workers who can run those kind of programs, still involved in youth ministry. Now, Elliot talked about volunteer teams, that they could help young people feel welcome in church and increase with integration. He warned against just throwing money at situation, and instead said when church members are volunteering their time, they help young people feel welcome in church at all times, in services, at youth groups, and because young people can see that those volunteers are there for them, are around lots of the time, and are sticking around for the long term. And so Elliot talks about the importance of having volunteers, of those people who can invest a little bit but for a long time. So those are the key things that I found out. But there are also a few other insights that came up through my research which didn't quite fit into my themes but I thought were important to share. So first of all, keeping it simple. Keeping it simple was all about people saying, well, actually what we do is really old-fashioned. It's just good, solid, local Anglicanism, really. There didn't seem to be a particular programme or scheme that worked much better than other places. It seemed to be building relationships, things involving food or sport or games, all those kind of things, but keeping it simple, not needing to reinvent the wheel. Another interesting insight that came out was actually that a lot of the churches that I looked at were central churches. So 66% of estate churches in this group with 25 or more under 16s were central churches, whereas Jimmy Dale found in his work nationally that was only 34% of churches. And so maybe perhaps some kind of support system for central churches could be useful. A number of churches I talked to which were part of different networks, either more evangelical churches and their networks, more Catholic churches. But having some kind of support for central churches seemed like it could be a good way forward. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the national pictures, national patterns did not seem to fit with what I found. There were, it seemed, no real patterns in the numerical data. Jimmy Dale found that large youth ministries were generally in big churches that were evangelical, that employed youth workers, that had a good link with schools, that had a big budget and were urban. However, I didn't find that pattern in my data. And so these could be the wrong categories to investigate when looking at estate churches, or they could be things that don't seem to be as important. And so when looking at national picture or looking at national strategy, it's important to realise that not all of those things fit in estates or in other contexts. And so a few recommendations from my research. Firstly, for local churches, this is what the interviewees suggested when I said, what one tip or what next step would you give to churches who wanted to invest in young people? These are some things that they said. Pray, gather a team, find a physical space, have leaders in it for the long run, share youth ministry experience with others, and think about the whole ministry. How do young people fit into the whole ministry of the church? And for organisations or for the national church, these were some things that came out. That some churches need financial support to employ youth workers. Perhaps they can't find someone who can have that oversight, who can commit to it, and so employing a youth worker would really help their youth ministry. As I mentioned, central churches may find support from a network or some kind of relationships for them to support them in their youth ministry and in other things. Invest in buildings. Physical space and buildings were really important, and so investing in them seemed to be an important thing if you want to focus on youth ministry in estates. Some work maybe needs to be done in investing in retaining youth workers for the long run. What does that mean? How can we do that better? And there were some questions from volunteers or some concerns about admin around safeguarding and other things. They found safeguarding, although very important, had quite a lot of admin, and so they did not have as much, they could not invest as much time in youth ministry because they felt like they were doing a lot of admin. And so is there a way to support volunteers with some doing admin and some leading ministry? Could that be a good support? So those are my thoughts and recommendations on youth ministry in estate churches. What makes it work well? I hope you enjoyed listening to some of the things I've had to say, and if you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Well, a huge thank you to Amy for providing us with that research and making sure that we're all able to engage with it and putting it out into the public domain. It's really, really good of you to be able to just share that so freely. So thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us here on NECN's YouTube channel. If you could like this video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, you'll get a notification. My name's Rob, I'm one of the trustees. See you later, bye-bye.